Stranger at the gates. Biff and Chip find themselves caught up in a battle zone where Vikings and Saxons are ranged against each other. King Alfred the Great wants peace, but there's a Varan in the Saxon camp who will do anything to stop him. That's the preview of this book, and today I'll be reading a book called Stranger at the Gates. This is the Treetops Time Chronicles series. It is created by Robert Kunt, Alex Brickdat, and also David Hunt, who joined this series. They also have the same character, Biff and Chip, who was in the Oxford Reading Tree series, but this series title is a bit different. Treetops Time Chronicles. This is stage 12. And it's the first book of the 12th stage. Alright, they are like all old now, Biff and Chip, and many other characters waiting in this book. So it might be a little bit different than the Oxford Reading Tree series. And now, let's start reading it. Chapter 1. The Varan stood quietly watching. From the ridge where he was, he could see the Viking camp. Smoke from their fires gently rose in the morning air. It all looked so peaceful. His eyes wandered beyond the camp's jagged wooden walls, over a forest to a muddy field some half-mile away. There, delicate trails of rising smoke marked another camp, the Saxon army camp, his camp. The Varan's mind drifted back to how it all began. Like an icy wind from the north, the Vikings had swept through the Saxon kingdom. For a time, the Saxon king, Alfred, had been on the run. Alfred's kingdom was in chaos. The Varan smiled when he remembered this. He had joined King Alfred's army for one reason only. He wanted to keep the war against the Vikings going and ruin any chance of peace. But now things seemed to be going well for Alfred at last. The Saxons had driven the Vikings back and surrounded their camp. The Vikings were trapped and had little food. They were close to surrendering. The Varan had to keep the battle going, but how? Hey! A voice interrupted the Varan's thought. Wolfgar! It was Roder, the son of one of King Alfred's chief men. Are you going to help me with this or not? Roder was standing by a heap of branches. It was Roder and Wolfgar's job to stack the branches into a bonfire called a beacon. If there was any trouble, the beacon could be lit and the fire would be seen for miles. It would be a signal to tell the Saxons to fight. Whatever you say, young sire, mumbled Wolfgar. They stacked the branches in silence till Roder suddenly spoke. I don't see the point of this beacon, he said. I mean, the Vikings are hungry and weak, so they won't fight. And as for King Alfred, he wants to make peace with the Vikings. He won't be lighting this, I can tell you. Rasped Wolfgar, but he said nothing more. His Varan mind was working fast. Roder threw the last of the branches on the stack. Done, he said. Let's go. Wolfgar watched Roder proudly. He straightened a gold brooch on his tunic. The brooch was from King Alfred. It meant Roder was important. All at once, Wolfgar saw his chance to start the two sides fighting again. Roder was important. If he could remove Roder, he could then go back to camp and make up a story about how some Vikings had surprised them and taken Roder prisoner. The kings and his chiefs would be angry. They would be sure to attack the Vikings then. Wolfgar and Roder climbed down the ridge to the thick forest below. For Wolfgar, the moment had came, the moment to take Roder. If Roder had turned to look at Wolfgar at that moment, he would have seen a blood-chilling sight. He would have seen the color drain from Wolfgar's face as a smothering darkness rose about him. He would have seen the violent darkness in Wolfgar. Chapter 2. All Biff knew was that she was in thick, tangled undergrowth. She struggled free of branches and thorns and scrambled over a fallen tree. A little way ahead, Chip had found a path. He was nursing a long scratch on his arm. Suddenly, there came the sound of squealing. A young boar burst through a mass of ferns and raced straight towards them. Biff and Chip got a lot older than the ORT series. I'll put on the top. You can see the face of them when they were young. In an instant, 2 arrows thwacked into the ground, just missing the boar's legs. Biff dived clearer as the boar leapt past her, but Chip was caught directly in front of it. All he could do was turn and run as the terrified boar plunged after him. Biff started to run after Chip, but another arrow dumped into the path in front of her. She stood still, hardly daring to breathe. The forest fell silent. Then, without a noise, a Viking boy stepped forward from the undergrowth. He held another arrow taut in his bow. It was pointed straight at Biff. She opened her mouth to speak. "Shh," the boy hissed. "I've got you, you Saxon spy. Come with me." Biff had no choice. The boy kept his bow and arrow trained on her, and they headed back to the Viking camp. Meanwhile, Chip continued to crash through the forest. As he ran, he turned to see if the boy was still behind him. But just then he stumbled over something solid and fell heavily to the ground. To Chip's amazement, a boy lay tied up at his feet. The boy opened his mouth to speak. "Rodo, beware," he managed to mutter. Muttering. Chip was confused. A wolf? He nervously looked around and found himself looking straight at the sharp end of a sword. A Viking girl stood pointing the sword at Chip. From her shoulder hung several dead rabbits. "So," she smiled, "we lost the boar but caught a couple of Saxons." "The boar!" Chip opened his mouth to speak. He wanted to ask about Biff, but the girl raised a finger to her lips. "Shh," she said. "Saxon soldiers everywhere." She flicked her sword towards Chip and Roder. "You must come with me," she muttered. "But do not make a sound." Chapter 3. Meanwhile, back at the Saxon camp, Wolfgar had made up a story about how Roder had been captured by Viking soldiers. The Saxon chiefs were furious. "War!" they all shouted. Wolfgar smiled to himself as he listened to their angry reaction. If only they knew the truth, that in fact he had used the power of his violent stare to wipe Roder's memory and left him to the darkness of the forest. Like a pack of barking dogs, the chiefs argued about what to do next. Only King Alfred sat as still as a statue listening. In his hand he clutched a scroll. It was the peace treaty he had hoped to offer the Vikings. Suddenly he stood up and drew the peace treaty into the center of the room. "War," he shouted. Are we to throw away the chance of peace so easily?" Chief Edwin, Roder's father, stepped forward. "But they have my son," he pleaded. Alfred rested his hand on Edwin's shoulder. "And how will attacking them help that?" he asked. Edwin lowered his head in sadness. "No," continued Alfred. The time has come to talk. It is only by understanding that we can settle our differences." The king pointed to the treaty that lay at their feet. It is the only way to end this hatred. Wolfgar struggled to hide his violent nature. The king's words of hope raised an angry darkness in him. King Alfred turned to Wolfgar. For a moment, Wolfgar thought the king might be on to him. Wolfgar, Alfred said, as you can speak so many languages, I should like you to go to the Vikings and read the peace treaty to them. The king looked around the room. Are we agreed? The room fell silent. Then slowly, Chief Edwin picked up the treaty and handed it to Wolfgar. We are agreed, he said. Chapter 4. Biff's link signal kept breaking up. Tyler sat in control, straining to hear her. The link speaker hissed and whirred. Beneath by her voice, lost ship, link, caught by Viking boy. I am in Viking camp. I'm frightened. Okay, Biff, stay calm, said Tyler. I'll try and locate ship. Oh, and Biff, he added. Don't worry about the Vikings. They're not as mean and scary as history says they are. Download to follow. Out! Easy for you to say, Tyler, muttered Biff as she closed her lips. She looked around. She was shut in a long, narrow building. Through gaps in the wooden walls, Biff could see a bit of the Viking camp, the outer wall, and some large wooden gates. A group of soldiers crouched playing a game with pebbles in the dust. A woman was cooking over a fire and singing gently to herself. As Biff listened, she thought of ship and she felt very alone. Chapter 5. It's no good, said a voice from the underworld. The voice made Ship jump. From a bank of thick ferns, the Viking girl, her name was Inga, suddenly appeared. Ship and Roder had been waiting while Inga checked to see if they could sneak back into the Viking camp just beyond the trees where they hid. Now she had returned and she didn't look happy. Saxon soldiers, she whispered. We'll have to wait till it gets dark, really dark. One good thing though, Inga pulled some tree bark from her pocket. I found this. What is it? Asked Chip. Inga glanced at Roder, who was still muttering to himself as if he was in a dream. Medicine, she said. She began to grit the bark into a pulp. An old Viking remedy. It is good for the head. Suddenly, Inga whirled around. A little way from where they were hiding stood a wild boar. Even Chip could see it was acting strangely. It stood still, sniffing the air, with every hair on his back bristling. Just then a horseman appeared. He was heading in the direction of the Viking camp, but also straight into the path of the snarling boar. The boar stood his ground and waited as it frozen to the spot. At the very last moment, the boar sprung into life and charged. Just the sound of his snarl was enough. The horse reared up in terror. The horseman was thrown heavily to the ground, his face twisted in fury. Chip shuddered. He could see why the boar had acted so strangely. It had sensed something strange, something evil. It had sensed a violence. Wolfgar got to his feet and tried to grab hold of the terrified horse, but it shooed away. He raised his arm in anger, and the horse turned and bolted. Without stopping, even for a moment, Wolfgar began to walk. He didn't even look round. Had he done so, he would have seen King Alfred's peace treaty. It was lying on the forward floor where he had fallen from his horse. Chapter 6. Inga broke the seal on the scroll of paper and read. The Saxon language is similar to ours. I can understand bits of this, but not too much. She handed it to Chip to read, but he could only understand one word. Alfred. Suddenly, Roder stood up. "Let me read it," he cried. Alfred, King of Saxon, England. He began to read, slowly at first, but then with more confidence. Roder's mind was beginning to focus. Wolfgar's mind stare was wearing off. As Roder read, his mind cleared and his memory began to return. "This is King Alfred's peace treaty. That was Wolfgar who..." Roder stopped. At the name Wolfgar, he shuddered. His mind had flooded with terrible memories of what had happened to him. It was Wolfgar. "He did this to me. I don't know how he did it, but he wiped my mind. I think I know," said Chip as he reached for his link. "We need to stop Wolfgar, and I need to find my sister." Chapter 7. So Chip's link had turned itself off. He must have knocked it when the boar chased him. Tyler was talking to Biff on the link. "Anyway, I've told him where you are. He's not far from you. He's with a Viking girl. They'll come and find you. But they've just seen the Viren in the forest. Chip thinks he might be coming to the Viking camp. They want to see what he's up to first. Tyler out." No sooner had Biff closed her link than she heard a cry from a board on the camp wall. "Stranger at the gates." In the moonlight, Biff could see the outline of Viking soldiers. With swords drawn, they cautiously opened one of the gates. A figure stepped forward from the shadows. It was Wolfgar. He was about to spend more lives in his quest for chaos. "What is it you want, stranger?" asked one of the soldiers. "I bring news," hissed Wolfgar. "The Saxons are sharpening their swords. They are preparing for war. Attack now, while you still have the chance." "Why should we believe you, stranger?" asked one of the Vikings. "They don't," sneered Wolfgar. "But can you really afford not to? The Saxons believe you hold one of their sons," Wolfgar continued. "He goes by the name of Roder." "There is no one here with that name," answered one of the Vikings. "Even if what you say is true," sneered Wolfgar, "the Saxons will never believe you. King Alfred is looking for a reason to fight." Suddenly, Biff heard a new voice. "You speak lies, Wolfgar." Wolfgar spun around as Roder stepped out of the darkness behind him. "The Saxons and the Vikings shall know the truth of what you have done," growled Roder. Wolfgar looked confused for a moment. How had Roder escaped? After all, he had tied him up and left him deep in the forest. Wolfgar turned to the Viking. "This boy has been sent to trick you," he barked. "No," shouted Roder. "King Alfred wants to offer a peace treaty to you Vikings." "Where's the proof?" laughed Wolfgar. "Here." Roder raised his arm in the air. In his fist, he clenched the peace treaty that Wolfgar had dropped. Wolfgar felt for the scroll Alfred had given him, but it wasn't there. In a raging darkness, he charged at Roder. Roder flinched in fear, but at that moment, Chip stepped forward. His zap trap glinted in the moonlight. "The game's up, Viren," he said. "Never!" screamed the Viren as he turned and fled into the night. Chapter 8. Chip tore through the dark forest. He couldn't see the Viren up ahead, but he could hear him. He knew Roder and Biff would be safe as long as the Saxons didn't attack. He hoped that Inga would show the Vikings the peace treaty. But his fear was that the Viren might have another trick ready that would restart the fight between the two armies. If a battle started, what would happen to Biff? If only for her, the Viren had to be stopped. Chip's leg began to feel heavy. He was breathing hard. He felt as if he were running uphill. He was. The Viren was heading up the ridge towards the beacon. He was going to light it. It would summon the Saxon army. Chip had to stop him at all costs. At the top, the Viren stopped at the beacon. He was fumbling in his pocket. His face twisted into a terrifying snarl as he watched Chip hurl a zap trap towards him. Chapter 9. Inga had only just let Biff out when a mighty cry went up in the Viking camp. High on the ridge, a cone of flame lit the night sky. The Saxon beacon had been lit. Viking soldiers called to one another as they watched the Saxon army gathering. Make ready, they cried. Biff's link whirred in her pocket. Tyler had sent a message from Chip. Download from Tyler. Chip on ridge, Vern caught. Sparks from Zaptrap lit the beacon. It is up to you to stop the battle. Biff's mind raced. How could she possibly stop a battle? He looked at Inga and Roder. He stood clutching the peace treaty nervously. All around them, Viking soldiers were moving out of the camps, ready to fight. Suddenly, Biff grabbed Roder and Inga and ran as fast as she could toward the Saxon army. From the ridge, Chip watched as the two armies scattered to face each other across an open field. Chip shook his head sadly. Through the Varen had been caught, he had won. The battle seemed impossible to avoid. Then, to his amazement, he saw Biff, Roder, and Inga running past the Viking soldiers and across the field towards the Saxons. On seeing Roder running towards them, the Saxons started to cheer. King Alfred stepped forward to greet him. Many of the Saxon chiefs gathered around Roder, Biff, and Inga. With his army following behind him, King Alfred started to walk towards the Vikings. Biff held her breath as she waited for the moment the two armies would meet. With every soldier holding a weapon at the ready, he felt sure that a terrible battle was about to begin. A few paces away from the Vikings, King Alfred stopped. The Vikings tensed as the king drew his sword. Then, slowly, he sank his blade into a muddy ground at his feet. Vikings, you could fight over these lands forever, but why, when there is enough soil for all to plug and grow their crops? Alfred stepped forward and held out his hand. Let us agree to divide this island between us and live side by side in peace. You rule by your laws, and we Saxons by our laws and our languages are so similar that in time we could even trade with one another. Slowly, one after another, the Vikings pushed their swords into the earth. No longer invaders, the Vikings were here to stay. Biff opened her link. Time to go, she said. And that was the glossary, some of the vocabulary words that learners won't know, and this is Tyler's mission report. Again, capture it. And it has some history. I'll read it. History. Downloaded. Vikings and Saxons. The Saxons came to expect the terrifying Viking race from across the North Sea. Everyone knew what the Vikings wanted. Treasure. The Saxons did their best to hide it, while the Vikings tore village after village apart to find it. But by the 9th century, things began to change. The Vikings were not after treasure so much as land. They wanted to settle. By the 870s, Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia were all under Viking influence. Now the Vikings turned their attention to the last great Saxon kingdom, Wessex, and its king, Alfred. Wessex very nearly fell to the Vikings. Had it done so, history would have taken a very different course. But against all odds, Alfred and his part-time army managed to defeat the Vikings and gain peace. The Viking king, Guthrum, made the peace with the Saxons. Alfred's peace treaty with the Vikings was brilliant because both sides were given honor and dignity. Rather than treating the Vikings as foreign invaders, the treaty recognized them and their king Guthrum as part of Britain. It recognized the lands under Viking rule known as Stanlaw and agreed laws to help the Saxons and the Vikings to live as neighbors. Yes, King Alfred. Okay. I also left you give you a link in the description so you could check this out for more information. And I will also read it too and end this video. A voice from history. When the Vikings came, they hit us fast and hard. They hit us when we last expected it. Christmas. Caked in freezing mud and forever hungry, we spent that winter hiding in a marsh. In those dark days, we often wondered if it was all worth it. I mean, what were we fighting for? A few scattered homesteads and a handful of animals? Was that all we were? Was that all we stood for? In a strange kind of way, the Vikings did us a favor. They made us ask these questions of ourselves. And so, with their victory, we decided to rebuild our kingdom. I'm not just talking about building a proper army and navy or fortifying our towns. All this we did. No, I'm talking about building of culture. Our history written down in poems and songs, and books, the best we could find, translated into a language. Now that is worth fighting for. I didn't knew that it would take like 30 minutes. Because also me, it was the first time reading it. I was just imagining the picture while I was just reading. I really didn't knew it was that long, but it will take like 30 minutes because it's the most difficult stage in the ORT. So now I will also upload some of the mini chapter books. It looked like a chapter book, but a little bit like it isn't that long, like 40 minutes to 1 hour. Alright, that was the plot, lots of scenes you could find and less colorful to me than the ORT ones. But it was still fun reading a chapter book with you. And if you have any book recommendation, please give me a comment and I will see you in the next video. Take care.